Hello, today is Tuesday, June 23rd, 2020. I'm Joe Schmidt from TC2, and this is Staying Connected. Today's podcast is part 2 of our 2-part podcast series covering the Universal Service Fund, or USF. I'm joined again by my colleagues, Andrew Brown, the Managing Partner of LB3 and the Chairman of TC2, and Theresa Knutson, a Fellow Director at TC2. Okay, guys, let's continue the discussion we began in part 1 about why end users pay so much more for network services, well above and beyond their negotiated rates, after you add on the cost of the Universal Service Fund assessment. On the last podcast, we talked about how that assessment will clock in at an all-time high of 26.5% beginning, very soon. So, Andrew, before we dive too deep into this, why don't you start by just answering a couple of basic questions that the three of us get all the time from our clients. The first question is, what is the Universal Service Fund? And the second is, why does it cost our clients so much money?
Sure. I mean, the first question is pretty straightforward. USF is basically just a government program that provides money to vendors so that they, in turn, can provide subsidized connections to certain kinds of users that fall into like 4 basic groups. The first and kind of most commonly known are people that live in high cost or rural areas where it's really expensive to build and maintain network infrastructure, like Theresa's home state of North Dakota, where you've got huge spaces and not a lot of people. So the Universal Service Fund provides money to carriers in those locations to provide service at below market rates. And then you have schools and libraries, which also get subsidized connections. You have people, low-income people who are below the poverty line and get subsidized, usually wireless service from Universal Service Fund. And then lastly, you have rural healthcare centers that rely on using telemedicine, so their connections are also subject to universal service subsidy. And when you add all that up, it comes out to about $8 to $10 billion per year in subsidy payments that are made from the Universal Service Fund to carriers that provide those connections. That number hasn't changed all that much over the last couple of years. And, it sounds like a really big number by Washington, D.C. standards. That isn't the biggest program.
And that gets us to the second question. It may not be that big of a program, but it's a huge cost to the end users that have to pay for it. You mentioned in the part 1 podcast that the USF funding system, it's just really messed up. Is that why it's so expensive for end users?
Yeah, that's exactly why. The first question deals with how you spend the money, and that's pretty easy and kind of the fun stuff in Washington, D.C. But what ultimately matters to end users is how you collect the money. And the current system for collections, or what are called contributions, is what's really messed up because it requires the carriers to fund that $8 to $10 billion annually from a percentage of the revenues that they earn from certain kinds of so-called assessed services. So you divide what you want to spend by the revenues you want to assess, and you get a percentage figure, which is called the USF contribution factor. The FCC calculates that factor each quarter so the carriers know what they have to pay. And as we just discussed in the last podcast, the factor for the upcoming quarter is this astonishing number, 26.5%, which is an all-time high.
So why does the contribution factor keep going up? I think you said that it jumped 35% from last quarter?
Yeah, right. Huge jump. Well, it keeps going up because the revenues for the assessed services, things like voice minutes on toll-free or regular voice or MPLS access connections, a bunch of other legacy type stuff, those revenues have been decreasing for a long time, and now they're rapidly decreasing. So when you do the basic math of a program that is increasing its disbursements, but the revenues supporting it are rapidly decreasing, you got a big structural problem that has been around since the system was created. A decade ago, the factor was 13.6. 20 years before that, it was 5.5%. So the growth in the contribution factor has been astonishing.
Yeah, and this is what Andrew has been describing as the USF death spiral. And we discussed a little bit on our podcast last time. So the percentage of the revenues that has to support the program starts to go up rapidly with bigger and bigger jumps each quarter, which is one we just saw. And if you're really curious as to how much money your company is directly paying in USF and associated regulatory fees, There are a variety of reports that the key U.S. supplier portals have available in them. So if you use Verizon, AT&T, CenturyLink, you can go into the reporting section of their portal and look for regulatory and tax reports. And before you look at that report, grab a chair, sit down, because you're going to be surprised at how big these numbers are.
Grab a chair now, because I'll give you some other numbers. I mean, just to give you an idea of the scope of the problem, assessed revenues were down 7% from the last quarter alone. That gives you an idea of how fast they're dropping. And disbursements from the fund jumped by 33%. So it's classic death spiral components that are resulting in these huge 35% increases quarter to quarter in the factor.
So, Theresa, we're talking about carrier revenues supporting USF, but end users, including enterprise customers, they are really the ones that pay for it.
Yeah, and of course. And so even though carriers are the ones that have to contribute USF, the FCC actually doesn't require the carriers to pass this fee on to the customers, but all the carriers do just that. They pass on the USF factors. They slap on this quarterly amount to customers' invoices for the relevant services. And even to make matters worse, the carriers also charge customers a USF admin fee to cover their internal cost of collecting and remitting these USF funds. So this is a totally made-up additive fee. That's anywhere from between 3 and 5%. And then to make matters worse, they charge USF on top of their USF admin fee. So it's just a never-ending process of layered regulatory fees. So this is why we care. So even though it's theoretically negotiable because it's just a cost of their doing business, no carriers actually negotiate these surcharges. When it first came out 20 years ago, you would see some kind of custom one-off deals that had some limits on that, but those are kind of a bygone era. So it's a waste of time to try to negotiate USF and these regulatory fees, but what you have to look at is the total cost of the business and the services that you're buying from the carrier and find ways to get decreases in other areas, or ultimately buy services that aren't assessed USF until the system gets fixed.
So let's talk briefly about customers moving to services that are not assessed USF. Can businesses do that?
Well, yes and no. I mean, there's this huge gaping hole in the assessment mechanism right now in that revenues from consumer broadband internet access are not assessed USF. So the carriers don't try to pass through any USF surcharge on those services.
Yeah, and so like with the uptake of the SD-WAN and internet first strategies that you're hearing about in enterprises, we're seeing companies move to like a network services model that partially and sometimes very significantly substitutes basic internet access for a more expensive form of access like MPLS. And so although there are very real technical justifications for evolving your network with SD-WAN and internet access, there's also a significant cost savings from switching to this alternative underlying access model. And these cost savings, at least for now, are even more significant if they don't include assessments like USF.
Yeah, and I mean, the cautionary note here is that moving to a different access form or technology just because of regulatory fee issues, what we call regulatory arbitrage, it's really not the way companies want to make network architecture decisions or even long-term financial decisions, because there's always the risk that those services will be assessed sometime in the future. So if you move to a different access model solely to avoid regulatory charges, you may end up moving services to avoid assessments only to find they get assessed later. Here's the good news, though. Even if broadband is assessed, and that's definitely on the table and probably the easiest path forward in reforming the system, estimates show that the contribution factor would fall dramatically down to something like 5%. And that would remain really stable for a long time. So you wouldn't see these huge jumps in the contribution factor quarter to quarter. And what that means is even if you do move to like an SD-WAN and broadband is assessed and it's not today, you're still likely to be saving a lot of money.
Well, that sounds promising. What other solutions are being considered to fix the system?
Well, you can assess something other than revenues. One good option is to assess phone numbers. Every device that has a phone number would pay something. It comes out to like 90 cents per line per month. There are like 800 million phone numbers, so it's a really broad and stable base that wouldn't change much at all quarter to quarter or year to year. You can assess connections to the network, where each connection pays a certain fee, and higher speed connections pay a slightly higher assessment based on the increase in speed. Under that model, like internet connections would have to be assessed, and it's definitely a more stable system, but it's a little hard to know at this point how much each connection would cost because there's not a ton of good inventory data out there right now about how many connections there are and what the speeds are.
Yeah, and I'll bet making changes to USF gets very political, doesn't it?
Yeah, that's an understatement. It does, because you're affecting some politically desirable subsidy money, and you're potentially changing who has to bear the burden for paying for it. And right now, there's this huge risk that the burden of USF is going to get shifted even further to businesses because they're perceived as having really deep pockets. Something that is, of course, not at all true given current economic conditions where businesses are potentially in really bad shape right now with the global pandemic.
Okay, thanks, Andrew, and thank you, Theresa. It's scary to think that businesses are going to face an even bigger burden right now with an increased USF assessment. So if you do want to understand this issue better or find out how you can maybe prevent any changes to the contribution system from shifting costs to enterprise budgets, please get in contact with Andrew, who has been working with companies on this issue for a long time. You can also contact Theresa, me, or reach out to any of our LB3 or TC2 professionals that you work with, and we'll get you some more information. Also, check out our websites and follow us on LinkedIn for some new content. And if you haven't already, subscribe to our Staying Connected podcast on Apple, Spotify, and many other podcasting platforms.